Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar From Idea to Assessment, Crafting Program Learning Outcomes, presented by Matthew DeSantis, the Assistant Director for Institutional Assessment at St. Edward's University. Just a couple notes before we really get started here. Everyone is on mute, but we do encourage your questions. Please type any questions you have in the questions block in the control panel. We already had a couple. Thank you for those. We will stop and answer questions at designated intervals in the webinar. So if we don't immediately answer your question, just know that that's coming up. And if for some reason we are unable to answer your questions here in real time, we will include a frequently asked questions document on the events page for this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online as soon as possible after we conclude here today. As we get started, we are going to begin with a quick poll. So please respond to this poll when it pops up on your screen. All right, thank you all for your participation in our poll. It looks like a little over half of the participants here today do have a full-time assessment person at their college. About 20% do not, and about 26% are not sure whether somebody is full-time in assessment at their institution. So welcome to you all, and I am going to turn the controls over to Matthew to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today at the webinar. Thank you to the Texas Success Center for hosting this webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity. As Christy said, the title of my webinar today is From Idea to Assessment, Crafting Program Learning Outcomes. I am currently at St. Edward's University, but I was not always at St. Edward's University. So prior to arriving at St. Edward's, I was a faculty member for most of my career, and most of that time was spent at Guilford Technical Community College in North Carolina. And about 18 months before our SAC-COC 10-year reaffirmation, the vice president called me and asked if I would take over assessment along with another faculty member. It was a rather daunting task, but it was one that really was very professionally fulfilling. And so over the next 18 months, as you see, I took part in a number of professional development activities geared toward assessment and helped rewrite several outcomes and install a new assessment process. I know some of you may be interested in hosting your own convocation days or having some sort of assessment day during convocation. Those are things that I'm happy to speak to during the question and answer period. And I think that there's certainly a lot of positives that can be taken out from those. After we successfully got through our SAC-COC reaffirmation, I was so enthralled with reaffirmation and accreditation and assessment that I accepted a position at Florida Southern College, which itself was also 18 months away from a 10-year reaffirmation, and was able to successfully lead our assessment initiative through that as well. I would not personally advise going from one school to another and going through 2 10-year reaffirmations in 36 months, but professionally it was very fulfilling and a really wonderful experience. So looking at our agenda today, the focus of today's agenda is on crafting quality program learning outcomes. And really, I want to take you step by step through how that process should look in an ideal setting. that will start from the standpoint of who should we be getting involved in the development and the writing of those outcomes, and then reviewing the best practices to ensure that when you write these outcomes that they are measurable and they are accessible. And then finally, how do you make sure that your program learning outcomes are scaffolded and aligned with the other outcomes at your institution? So Christy was kind enough to share with me a lot of the wonderful work that's been done on guided pathways here in Texas. And I know Pillar 4 is focused on ensuring students are learning. And in particular today, this webinar will address two of the essential practices. The first, making sure that program learning outcomes are aligned in such a way to promote student success post-graduation and in their employment careers. And then additionally, to make sure that program learning outcomes are written in a way that programs are capable of assessing whether or not students are mastering those skills, whether it be in arts and sciences or in career technical programs. Additionally, the Texas Pathways model is something that I think is important to keep in mind as we go through this process, because program learning outcomes are a critical component to this model. In many cases, program learning outcomes are capable of attracting students. So that initial connection process, having students see what they're capable of learning if they choose a particular program of study, can be a very powerful draw. Additionally, program learning outcomes need to take into account where students are entering, what level of learning and knowledge base that they have, and then obviously structured in such a way that students, as they progress through the program and ultimately graduate, are able to be successful as it relates to those program learning outcomes. So one of the things that I encountered when I came to St. Edward's was that every meeting at St. Ed's begins with a reflection piece. And it's just a wonderful practice, and it's something that I encourage some of you to perhaps use at your own institutions. But it's a way of just focusing a meeting and taking a lot of negative energy or agendas out of the room. When we all meet together and somebody shares a reflection and we spend a minute or two thinking about it ourselves and sharing our thoughts, it's a way of really, like I said, focusing the meeting and making sure and reminding us why we're at the meeting and why we're at the institution. So like I said, a lot of times it's just a quote or a story, and being at St. Edward's sometimes is occasionally scripture, but it's whatever somebody wants to share during that particular meeting. And so for this webinar, I thought I would share one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill, which is, "Perfection is the enemy of progress." And I think that's particularly pertinent as it relates to program learning outcomes and assessment in general. Assessment, program learning outcomes, the assessment process, the artifact collections, it will never be perfect, but that should not prevent you from continuing that progress. Program learning outcomes, once crafted, are still going to be problematic in some way. Rubrics are still going to be problematic in some way. That's okay. That should never prevent you from taking that next step. And the assessment process is there so that you find those imperfections and inconsistencies and continue to strive and work towards an ultimate goal. So this first section is focused on getting involved with program learning outcomes and who in particular should be engaged in this process. So we want to connect with external stakeholders. I think that's the first thing that needs to be done when thinking about crafting a quality program learning outcome, is you need to reach out to as many people as possible. And that varies depending on the program that you are involved with. So if you are in a more college transfer friendly program, you're going to be reaching out to four-year colleges and universities. You're going to be reaching out to department chairs at those universities or deans and trying to get a sense of what are their expectations for what your students should know when they arrive at their university. So getting a sense of where do our program learning outcomes need to align? What are the skills that they're looking for? What's the knowledge base they're looking for when they do finally make that transfer to a four-year institution? Similarly, if you are in a career technical program, you're going to want to speak to local industry leaders or third-party accreditors. As it relates to local industry leaders, you want to see what are the skills, what's the knowledge base, what's the level of proficiency, what's the level of mastery perhaps that is generally considered necessary in the industry, so that you can get a sense of, what level with which you need to write those program learning outcomes. Similarly, I know there are a lot of technical programs that have third-party accreditors, and in those cases, I've seen some where it's highly scripted, where the third-party accreditation agency basically tells you what your program learning outcomes are. Other times they simply give guidance, but whatever the case may be, obviously consulting with third-party accreditors or state and federal agencies as well. So engaging with those external stakeholders is critical, but it ultimately shouldn't drive the development of the program learning outcomes. As I said, you shouldn't just take what people say and just implement it without consulting in-house, but it should just be a guide for some of the big ideas, skills, and knowledge base that your students should acquire. Ultimately, you have to also engage with faculty, and all the faculty. I would say all full-time faculty in a program should be engaged during the development of the program learning outcomes. I've seen instances where department chairs have been very well-meaning, but have wanted to save their faculty from having to worry about assessment. And I've seen department chairs sit down with a laptop and type out program learning outcomes, and the outcomes themselves were great, but the assessment of those outcomes and the assessment culture at that program would never reach its potential because the faculty, the rank and file faculty, never felt ownership of the program outcomes. So as well intended as the department chair was in that case, they really undermined the ultimate success of those program learning outcomes and the ultimate success of assessment at the program. And so engaging as many of your full-time faculty as possible is so critical. Obviously, having regular meetings about this is important. Using perhaps a professional development day to have an assessment day activity or to have retreats is another way of ensuring full-time participation. When I was at Guilford Tech, we had a very large English department. We had about 25 to 30 faculty members in that department full-time. That was not an ideal setting to discuss program learning outcomes. You can imagine 25 or 30 people sharing their ideas about this, and it got very loud very quickly. And so what they decided to do was create a subcommittee and a committee of about, I think, 4 or 5 faculty who crafted program learning outcomes and then brought them back to the department for consideration. And then there was a much more nuanced discussion at that point. So for those of you who may be in larger programs, that was certainly the case. I was on the opposite side of the spectrum when I was a faculty member. I was the only full-time political science instructor at Guilford Tech. So I had a conversation with myself a lot of times about what I thought were good program learning outcomes. And I tried to engage my adjunct faculty as much as possible. But as I say here, it's also something that will vary significantly from department to department. I also would say it's an opportunity, this entire process is an opportunity for junior faculty to take a leadership role. One of the things that I was really excited about that we did at Guilford Tech was the assessment contact in every program, as much as possible, was neither a department chair nor the program coordinator. The assessment contact was a junior faculty member. Now, as I said, some programs are very small, such as my own and others, where there was only one full-time staff person. And so obviously in those cases, that person was the assessment contact. But in larger programs, we really tried to take some of the responsibilities off the plate of the department chair and program coordinator and empower junior faculty to be more involved in the assessment process. As I just briefly mentioned before, engaging part-time faculty I know is tricky. I've seen some departments have this discussion without any engagement from part-time faculty. They develop program learning outcomes, they build modules, they develop assignments, they embed them into the learning management system at their institution, and basically drop things into the part-time faculty members' courses, and they go from there. And within those departments, there's a culture where that's acceptable, and the part-time faculty actually really like that. On the other hand, there was another department, I believe it was psychology, where there were only maybe 4 or 5 part-time faculty, and there was just a culture that even though they couldn't pay the faculty for their time outside of the classroom, the part-time faculty would come at the beginning of the year and have a department meeting, and the department chair would pay for breakfast in a lot of cases, but they would engage their part-time faculty in this process as well. So it's not something that you should feel strongly one way or the other, but I do think it's often a matter of the culture of the department and the program. So I'll stop here for a moment, and if Christy wants to relay any questions that you might have that we've had up to this point about engagement or any other general questions about assessment.
We'll give our participants just a moment to answer or to ask any questions. Currently, we have no questions about the content. We had one audio issue, but otherwise it seems like everything is going okay. So please proceed, and we'll see if we have more questions as we move on.
All right, great, thank you. We'll definitely have questions after this next part, I can guarantee you that. So the next step is focusing on crafting quality program learning outcomes. And this is something that, once again, going back to my reflection piece, it is iterative. It is never going to be perfect, and that should not prevent us from trying and going through the process. So the first thing, based upon the stakeholder feedback you've gotten, I would do is analyze that data, do some sort of content analysis, or just look through your notes and analyze what feedback have you gotten and what's been consistently mentioned in terms of skills or knowledge from your external stakeholders, whether that be four-year colleges and universities, third-party accreditors, or local industry. Review that information and come up with a short list of maybe 3 or 4 ideas that really seem to be consistently stressed across all of these conversations. Additionally, I would also review all of your course level SLOs within a program to identify skills or knowledge that were emphasized throughout the curriculum. Something that I've seen is that a lot of times departments will create very good and very well-written program learning outcomes. But when we actually go back and look at whether or not those program learning outcomes are manifested in any individual course, we see that's actually not the case. So a good example of this is something like communication. Most programs have some sort of communication program learning outcome. And yet, when you go back and look at your course level SLOs, a lot of times communication is not necessarily called out specifically. It's just something that's kind of assumed to be happening, but it's never called out as a course level student learning outcome. And so that's something that needs to be grappled with a little bit, to say we're expecting students to communicate effectively, whether it's written, whether it's orally or in writing, and yet that's not important enough for us to embed into a course level SLO. And so I think that can give you a sense of perhaps how to better align your course level learning outcomes with your program learning outcomes. But once again, going through those course level SLOs, what are the skills, what's the knowledge that are just repeatedly brought up over and over again, maybe in 3 or 4 different courses, what seems to keep coming up. And then ultimately ask faculty within the program what they want their students to know upon graduation. When I meet with a department or a program for the first time, I ask them 2 very basic questions, and this is how we kick off assessment. I say, what do you want your students to know, and how do you know they're learning it? And from there, we have a really great conversation. But that's at the heart of assessment. What do you want your students to learn? How do you know they're learning it? And so getting faculty feedback on that and compiling all of those different themes from your external stakeholders, your course level learning outcomes, and your faculty is critical. So once the common themes have been identified, you obviously want to determine at what level those skills or knowledge should be mastered. And I'm going to use the term mastery a lot, and I know that turns people off sometimes. You can certainly use the word proficiency or another word that might mean something similar in your own institution, whatever might get more traction with your faculty or administration. But obviously you want to be consulting Bloom's taxonomy, which is a great resource to determine the action verbs associated with the particular outcomes and the level of learning and the hierarchy of learning that you're going to be asking your students to achieve at the program level. And then you want to continue to use external feedback. So this is where not only thinking about what skills do employers or industry or colleges and universities want from your students, but at what level do they want those skills to be manifested? Do they just want students to appreciate communication, or do they want students to demonstrate communication and effective communication? So that's kind of a very simple designation, but an important one. And as I said here, program learning outcomes should be properly aligned with course level SLOs. And so to kind of make that point a little bit more clear, the next slide shows Bloom's hierarchy. And this is a hierarchy of learning, starting at the bottom with the most basic level, remembering, moving up to understanding, applying, analyzing, creating, or evaluating, excuse me, and then finally creating. And what I mean by making sure that your course SLOs are aligned with your program learning outcomes is that if during your analysis of your course learning outcomes, you realize that you're asking students to consistently remember and understand, and yet at the program level, you're asking your students to evaluate or analyze, that seems unfair to the student. So you want to make sure that throughout your curriculum, that is gradually getting ramped up to your capstone or final course in the program. Indeed, your introductory courses might start with a very basic remembering and understanding, but then they should be moving up level by level throughout the program. Now, some programs, graphic design, I think is a good example of this, probably start out at the very top. A lot of times, graphic design programs, students are creating from the very first semester. And that's wonderful. A lot of fine arts programs, I think, are like this. Culinary probably is like this a little bit as well, where students are creating right from the get-go. And there, the verbs associated with the outcomes, Bloom's hierarchy, you're obviously not going to be able to move up any higher, but it's really the level of difficulty and the level of sophistication of what you're creating that is going to evolve and change throughout the time of a program. So this is, I'm using this next slide as kind of an example for how you might look ahead to what university program learning outcomes are and how that could then inform the level with which you want your students to attain mastery or proficiency of different skills. So here are the program learning outcomes for St. Edward's University and Texas State University and their political science departments. And obviously what you see here is this is what is expected of a student after they complete a 4-year degree. So being at a 2-year institution, it's not necessarily saying that you have to meet them halfway or that you can only meet them halfway, but that you don't want to overreach, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You don't want to start forcing a higher level of learning on students that may not be applicable for them when they move on. So for instance, looking at the first outcome listed under Texas State University, ask relevant research questions pertaining to political science and research papers and internships. This is a good example of an outcome that if you really take off that last preposition, might be an effective outcome at a 2-year institution. You may not have the opportunity for every student in a program to have research papers or an internship experience. And so, but you may want to get them engaged in asking relevant research questions pertaining to the discipline. And so getting them, you know, halfway there, so to speak, and then having them be able to fulfill that outcome once they transfer to Texas State through these other programs. Similarly, if you look at something like the 5th outcome at St. Edward's University, appraise the concepts and limitations of major methodological approaches in political science. That's another instance where that's probably not going to be feasible at a 2-year institution, but perhaps just identifying those concepts and limitations, or being exposed to them, or being able to remember, understand, or you know, analyze those at that level would be sufficient. And then there would be a continuation of those program learning outcomes at the St. Edward's in research methods classes and a senior seminar course, et cetera. So like I said, if you go across and look at Texas State's number 5, use a variety of appropriately cited sources, that's an example of an outcome that you can certainly have in your program, and that's only going to continue to get reinforced throughout their time at Texas State. So once you develop program learning outcomes, you want to make sure that they are measurable, and program learning outcomes should be clear, concise, and have proper context. The two examples that are on the left under the perhaps it is subjective or a normative assessment of me to call them bad, but these are real examples that I've received in the past, very well-intentioned examples, and but you can see they both had their issues. The first example there was a communication learning outcome, and I actually edited this down slightly. It was longer than this. There were more things, but deploy a variety of occasion-appropriate techniques and use posture, movement, volume, vocal expressiveness, rate of speaking, and eye contact to engage the audience through authentic demonstration of confidence and command of material. That's a mouthful. That's a lot to assess, and it's not a very good outcome. And so working with the faculty, what we developed was employs effective communication techniques in a professional setting through reports and presentations. And this is a common issue that a lot of times when outcomes are developed, you will see the tendency to list a lot of different specific skills, as you saw here, as it relates to different communication techniques. What I would say is all of those different communication techniques should really exist within your rubric. So your outcome itself is just simply effective communication techniques. And then with your rubric, you would have a dimension that speaks to how well they postured, how well their movement and vocal expression and volume, all of these things. So that's something that all of those individual items can end up getting embedded within the rubric. So they can still be assessed, and we're not saying those are not important, they are very important. But is there a better way to articulate that to make sure that it can be assessed more effectively? So I think that's an important example. The other one is kind of the other side of the spectrum, which is appreciate critical thinking, which I've seen before. And you can kind of go in this direction. That could be a program learning outcome for any program. It doesn't particularly mean a whole lot. There's no context to it. And so we worked together and developed a program that works, I think, a little bit better, of demonstrates critical thinking skills in the delivery of patient-centered care to well and ill patients. And this was an allied health program. And so this was the opportunity to work with faculty and get them to think, where do they want these critical thinking skills to be manifested, and how should it be integrated with the other content of the program? So just as when I was a faculty member and I would assign a paper to students, their first question was how long? How long should it be? How many pages should it be? When I talk about program learning outcomes, the first question that I usually get from faculty and administrators is, well, how many? How many program learning outcomes should I have? And I would say the best practice is somewhere between 4 and 6. And obviously, as I say here, unless it's dictated, otherwise dictated by a state or federal agency or a third-party accreditor. I know that can be the case, and obviously you need to follow through with those requirements and those restrictions as you see fit. But if you don't have any of those restrictions from outside agencies or outside accreditors, like I said, 4 to 6 gives you a good base. Remember, you're going to have to assess all of these, and assessment takes time. So I once worked with a program in business administration, and I showed up and said, let me see your program learning outcomes. And they had 15 program learning outcomes. And we talked at great length about why they had 15. And they actually felt quite strongly about it. And it was a process. It was kind of a back and forth. And we eventually got them down to 7, which was, I thought, a pretty wonderful task. But it was something that was, once again, it was iterative. And in many ways, they had developed these outcomes without ever having us to assess them before. And so the greatest learning process they went through was the assessment. And once they started to assess, they realized, oh my gosh, we don't want to do this 15 times for 15 different program learning outcomes. And they started to realize that there were very authentic and organic ways to ensure that we could combine the same ideas and skills and knowledge within a smaller number of outcomes. My other point here speaks to the fact that students should be able to achieve your outcomes no matter what sequence of courses they make in the program. Obviously, there are required courses within your program, but no matter what electives a student chooses to take, that should not hinder their ability to achieve your program learning outcomes. And if that is the case, then it's an opportunity for you to go back and look at the curriculum in your program and make some curricular decisions about whether or not a particular elective within your program may need to become required because it's necessary for them to attain a certain skill. So when we map program learning outcomes, this is, I think, the next step. Once you have your program learning outcomes written, what you want to do is then place them over top of your curriculum map, so to speak, and place them over top of the required courses within your program. All program learning outcomes should be introduced, reinforced, and mastered. Those are 3 essential steps. Ideally, those steps should take place over multiple semesters. You should not be introducing, reinforcing, and mastering a concept in one semester. That's simply unfair to the student. It's unfair to the instructor, quite frankly. Now, that being said, I know there are some technical programs where a particular skill or a particular knowledge is so prerequisite for the job, and that skill and knowledge is only exists in one particular course. That in some cases that does have to be the case, and that has to happen. But ideally, you would want to space this introduction, reinforcement, and mastery across your curriculum. That doesn't mean you have to assess every single one of those courses. What it simply means is that you are ensuring that the outcome is brought up in a course, reinforced throughout the curriculum, and then there's a point at with which the student can demonstrate mastery towards the end of that program. So here's a very basic program learning outcome map. And this is, so there are 4 program learning outcomes, and I developed just 4 required courses. And you can see by looking at this map, program learning outcome 1 is introduced in the first required course, reinforced in the following 2, and then finally mastered in the final required course. PLO2 is introduced and reinforced in the second required course and mastered in the 4th. PLO3 is introduced, reinforced, mastered in sequential courses. And then finally, PLO4 is introduced in the first required course and then reinforced and mastered in the final one. So PLO1 and 3 are really good examples of how ideally your program learning outcomes should be spread across your programmatic curriculum, that they're introduced at an early stage, they're reinforced throughout, and then there's an opportunity for the student to master it at the end. PLOs 2 and 4, on the other hand, demonstrate where there might be some issues, and it might be just some further discussion. And maybe it does have to stay that way, but if I were looking at this as an outsider, I would say, I'd like to talk to the faculty about those 2 particular outcomes and maybe where those skills are brought up. So PLO4 is actually an example from that I had from Guilford Tech when I met with the faculty in automotive and auto body redesign. When I met with the faculty in those areas, they were very displeased about how well their students were doing with regards to customer service. They were just not achieving that outcome at the level that the faculty wanted them to. And so we went through this process of saying, okay, well, where's this outcome introduced and where's it reinforced and where's it mastered? And they realized that customer service was brought up in the very first semester in the very first course. And the customer service was not embedded into any other courses until the final course in their program. And so students were introduced to this idea at the very beginning, and it could be 2 or more years until they were reinforced or reintroduced to this idea of customer service and had an opportunity to practice that and live that and get feedback on it. And so what the faculty did is they realized this and they embedded customer service initiatives and customer service assignments into other programs throughout their curriculum. And the following, I guess, 2 years later, when the next cohort came through, they were really pleased with the results and we saw really significant improvement. So sometimes it can just highlight a gap that you might not even realize exists within your particular program. The other thing that I would emphasize here, and I don't have an example for this on the particular map, but if you write your program learning outcomes and then you simply don't find courses that those program learning outcomes map to within your required courses, and this goes back to something I mentioned earlier, or those outcomes are really more closely aligned with potential elective courses within your program, then it's time for you to rethink some curricular decisions and to really sit down and go, do we need to rethink the curriculum and reframe the curriculum and make changes to it, or do we need to rethink this outcome? Maybe this outcome is not as critical as we thought it was. And once again, that's important to go back and look at your homework and look at, well, what did external stakeholders say and what do your faculty think, and get as much feedback on that as possible. So the other thing I would stress is just continued refinement through this whole process. So after you craft and map program learning outcomes, you are going to have to revise those, and that is perfectly fine. Right now at St. Edward's, we are starting we just started this past year, a brand new general education curriculum. On Friday, we are going to assess the first artifacts from our critical thinking outcome, and that is going to be a process. We developed an internal rubric to assess critical thinking. That rubric is not perfect, and that's okay. I told the people who developed it that, and I said, just let's get something out there. Don't let, once again, perfect be the enemy of progress. And so they produced, I think, a very, very good rubric. But I think that through the assessment process, they're going to find issues with it. And also they're going to start to realize that maybe some of the assignments that were submitted to be assessed may not be ideal. And what does that mean? And does that mean the rubric needs to change? Does that mean we need to give more development to faculty to make sure that they understand what are the best types of assignments to submit? Do we need to rethink the outcome at all? It's a process though, and that should never be scary. One thing I'll say is SACS COC, and we should never be doing assessment because of SACS, but it is the kind of the sword of Damocles that hangs over our head all the time. That the reality is that SACS COC does not evaluate the quality of your program learning outcomes or the quality of your general education outcomes. SACS has very little to say as it relates to the actual verbiage of those outcomes. What SACS is overwhelmingly looking for is that you have a process in place and that you are learning from the information you're receiving. Just as you're trying to measure student learning, assessment is about learning yourself and learning about where there are gaps, not only in student learning, but in our own processes, and that we are constantly going back and revising and improving over and over and over again. Like I said, it's iterative, and that's so that should never prevent you from getting started, and it shouldn't prevent you from saying, well, let's take one more go at this rubric. Well, let's take one more go at this outcome. It's good to put in a lot of work on that, but at some point you just have to kind of see how it works out. So I'll stop there. If there are any additional questions at this time about crafting or any other parts of the assessment, I'm happy to speak to those.
We do have a few questions. So going back a little ways in your presentation, we have a question about, is there a hierarchy for the arts? I think related to the comment that in some programs, creating is going to happen early. So is there a hierarchy specifically for the arts?
That's a really good question. There's not a uniform hierarchy in that way specifically for the arts. What I would say is, similarly, that said, if you look at Bloom's taxonomy and you look at that highest level of creating, there are a variety of different verbs that fall under creating. And so there may be some level of gradation there that might be applicable to the arts, where maybe introductory courses speak to certain verbs, whereas more kind of intermediate or kind of mastery level courses or upper level courses speak to higher levels, just even within that highest level of hierarchy. The other thing I would just reiterate is the verb itself may not change that much, but the substance of the student learning outcome is obviously going to change significantly from the time they're a first year student to the time they are from the time they graduate from the program.
Okay, we have another question. It's, what about programs that have stackable credentials? That is, they have different levels of certificates. Do you suggest PLOs be stacked accordingly?
Yes, I would. That's a great idea. And so that's a great example of having stacked program learning outcomes is a great way to ensure that the learning outcomes are aligned and that they are sequential and that the students are able to achieve them in a particular order. So absolutely, if you could have your program learning outcomes stacked in such a way that they reflect those stackable credentials. I think that would be ideal. And I've seen other, as kind of maybe a slight aside, I've also seen programs where, because it also reminds me not just stackable credentials, but separate tracks, where you might have one degree, but maybe 2 or 3 different tracks of that degree. And in those cases, you might have uniform program learning outcomes for the entire program, but you might have 1 or 2 specific track outcomes for a college transfer program versus a straight to career program. So I'm thinking something maybe like business administration, where you could transfer to a 4-year school. Maybe there's outcomes just generally for business administration, but there's a couple of particular outcomes if you're considering to transfer. There's a couple of different outcomes if you're considering going into industry right away.
And our last question for now, for 2-year degrees, specifically associate in arts degrees with only a few 2000 level discipline specific courses, which can be taken in any order, how could the introduce, reinforce, master scheme be applied?
Yeah, great question. And that is always an issue. I would say that is where, and this actually dovetails nicely into the final section, this is where scaffolding, I think, is really important. So whether or not that skill is happening in your degree, you may not have the opportunity for that to be happening within your particular discipline, but are those skills being introduced, reinforced, and mastered within other general education courses that they're taking at the institution? So that's another thing to consider. And I think that dovetails pretty nicely into this kind of final section. So I'll continue to answer that question as I move on, because I do think that's a really important distinction to make.
Okay, we have one more before we go
Sure.
on. Sorry about that, late question here.
Yep.
So regarding the mapping and then assessment, is the required curriculum that's used for the program learning outcome implemented and assessed at the course level, or is there a separate assignment that's done for students for the purpose of program assessment?
Yeah, you could go either way. What I would encourage is to do it at the course level and to develop an assessment or an assignment that properly is able to assess that student's proficiency as it relates to that particular outcome. And I know there's always issues. Faculty will many times, and I know I felt this way when I first started doing assessment, because when I first heard the word assessment, I had no idea what they were talking about. And I remember the first time I crafted learning outcomes, I just wrote what I thought sounded good. I didn't know there were rules and structures around any of this. So I think that what tends to happen is that faculty feel as if you're assessing at the course level, you're assessing my course. And that simply isn't the case. When we assess, I assess student learning. I just happen to use your course as a vehicle to do that, but I'm not assessing your course. And I understand that learning is taking place over the entirety of a particular program and general education curriculum at an institution. So that's why I always am more in favor of having embedded assignments at the course level, so that and it's just more authentic assessment. And it's a little bit easier, I think, for students too, for it to be an assessment and an assignment that's just part of their natural curriculum and not something else that is added on to it at the end. Okay, so I will go back to that previous question and continue to answer that as I move forward. So scaffolding, this is something that is a buzzword, I think, right now in assessment and higher education in general. And it is very critical that we have alignment between our course level student learning outcomes, our program, and our general education level outcomes. Starting at the most basic level or course level outcomes, they tend to be specific and they tend to be content based and they tend to be knowledge based, I should say. When I taught political science, one of my course level learning outcomes was for students to identify and interpret, or maybe not interpret, it was identify and comprehend or analyze the Bill of Rights. Perfectly good student learning outcome for a course that was dictated by the state of North Carolina, but perfectly fine student learning outcome for a course. Is that something that I cared that they learned about in a program? You know, that was something I would always think about. What do I want my students to know 10 years from now? what from this program should they take with them 10 years from now? And that's where, at least on the college transfer side, I think you really move away from some of the specific disciplinary content. That's not to say that should not be in your outcomes at the program level, but when you start to think about what really do you want students to take with them after they leave your institution, it's how to think critically, how to communicate effectively, how to problem solve, how to work as part of a team. Those are really the big skills that you want students to take away. And so couching those skills within your particular program and putting them within a disciplinary context is, I think, kind of the next step of where your program's learning outcomes tend to go. So as I say here, your program learning outcomes speak to a broader knowledge base, more skill-based, so it's more about thinking and communicating and reasoning and that sort of thing. And then your general education outcomes kind of sit alongside your program learning outcomes, not necessarily above, but they tend to reflect college priorities. What does the college care about? Here at St. Edward's, we have an ethical reasoning requirement in our general education. And that's because of the type of institution we are. At other institutions where I've been, that was not something that was a requirement. So general education outcomes tend to reflect institutional priorities. They also tend to be integrative. What I mean by that is those skills should be integrated not just in gen ed classes. And this goes back to that previous question. Those skills should be embedded in the program and at the course. Whether or not it's a gen ed course or not, you should be reinforcing critical thinking and communication and problem solving and teamwork. And that should be happening throughout your curriculum. There may be certain designated courses that are gen ed and certain designated courses that are required within your program, but that doesn't mean those are the only places the students are learning those particular skills for that particular outcome. So you just want to make sure all of these ideas are aligned. So to continue with this, you also want to make sure, and this goes back to a point I made earlier, that your student learning outcomes are properly preparing students at the program learning outcome level. This was something I encountered when I was at Florida Southern. The history department really emphasized communication. This was something that was very important to them. And they were consistently appalled by their students' communication skills in senior seminar. And we sat down and we looked at their course level learning objectives and outcomes. And at no point did they ever talk about communication. So everybody said, well, it's kind of embedded into other courses. And I said, okay, well, where and how? And we had this conversation, and it turned out that nobody was actually assigning oral communication because everybody thought another person in the department was doing it. So everybody, it was kind of like that Spider-Man meme that I see sometimes where two Spider-Men are pointing at each other. Everybody's just kind of pointing at each other and kind of going, well, don't you have a oral presentation in your class? And they'll say, no, I hate doing oral presentations. And I'm like, well, I don't have it in my class either. And so through this conversation, they realized nobody was actually teaching oral communication in their courses. And they were just hoping that they would pick it up through the gen ed, which they picked up to an extent, but once again, that was typically a first or second year course, and here they are presenting their senior seminar paper. So once again, you want to make sure those course level outcomes are adequately preparing students for program learning outcomes. And then PLOs, you want to make sure they're aligned. They don't have to be scaffolded necessarily, but that your program learning outcomes have some commonality with your general education outcomes at the institution. Once again, your program learning outcomes are going to take some of those general education skills or competencies and place them in a disciplinary context. So the example I gave earlier about critical thinking and applying that idea to a nursing program, that idea of appreciate critical thinking, appreciate may not be the best verb to use there, but the idea of just critical thinking as a general education outcome is quite common. But the program might take that idea and then couch it within their own disciplinary and subject matter terms. And like I said, ultimately, general education program and course should be reinforcing each other and supporting a student's educational journey through college. You don't want students to be confused about the sort of skills or practices that are going to be important to them, or that one program is telling them one thing and the general education curriculum reflects something very different. So those are the things just important to keep in mind. So I will stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about assessment, not just related to program learning outcomes, but whether it's professional development activities for faculty, assessment day activities, the assessment process. I'm happy to speak about that as well. And I've also included my email here in case you want to feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'm happy to speak with you and work with you and your institution as you work through this process of assessment.
Thank you so much, Matthew. We do have another question. So how do you address co-curricular assessment?
That's great. Not easily. And so that's a wonderful question, though, and something that we're doing right now at St. Edward's. So co-curricular assessment is, I think, increasingly becoming a much more important part of the larger assessment process. And so I'll use the St. Ed's example, just because when I was at Guilford Tech, we didn't have a ton of co-curricular assessment that was taking place. So at St. Edward's, though, we are very interested in how study abroad, for instance, contributes to student comprehension and learning of a program. And so that really speaks more to the general education level. So students will engage in study abroad. We actually have a kind of a 1-credit course that they're enrolled in. That's just kind of a study abroad course aside from their other coursework. And through that 1-credit course, we collect artifacts and are able to see the student growth as it relates to the particular outcome it is being mapped to. But if you have substantial co-curricular activities at your institution, that should be brought into the mapping process. And if it is something that every single one of the students in your program is engaged in some co-curricular activity, then that needs to be brought in and thought about with regards to what are the outcomes that we're going to develop, how we're going to collect that information. Is there something that is extractable from that co-curricular experience or accessible from that co-curricular experience? And maybe it's something that's an indirect assessment as well. You know, this is the other part of it that I'll try not to kind of go off on too much of a tangent here, but all of the things that I've been talking about throughout the webinar are really examples of direct assessment, taking student work, scoring it for a particular outcome to see student learning. Co-curricular activities have the opportunity to demonstrate indirect assessment. In other words, asking students themselves about their learning experience, getting feedback through surveys, getting feedback through focus groups or through interviews with students. That's very rich information that can help inform improvement in the co-curricular area and within your own program. So those are, indirect assessment should not be something that should be shied away from, but it should be something that's done just in concert with more direct assessment measures. So I would say from a co-curricular standpoint, see if there are artifacts you can collect, but absolutely bring that in and consider that part of a requirement within a program if every student in the program is fortunate enough to partake in that co-curricular experience.
Okay, we have a number of questions, and I will get to one that could be its own webinar, but if you briefly address, how do you get faculty beyond being defensive about assessment?
Carefully. And it helps to, I think, yes, this could be its own webinar. I actually gave a presentation about this at IUPUI Assessment Conference with myself and Catherine Welberg and Fawn Grassetti. And I would say there's a couple of things. First, I've been fortunate in that I started as a faculty member, and that when I started doing assessment, I was still a faculty member. And so there was a level of empathy that other faculty had towards me because they thought I was having a very unenviable task. And so we were able to have very productive conversations and very honest conversations, and I was able to leverage kind of personal relationships in that way. The other, kind of a couple of other things, one is to emphasize that their courses are not going to be assessed. This goes back to a point I made earlier, that we're assessing student learning. And we just happen to be using your course to assess that learning. But that by no means should reflect the quality of your instruction in that particular course. Because ultimately the students, if curriculum is well integrated, this is something that should have been introduced, reinforced throughout their curriculum, throughout their program, outside of their program. So it is a culmination of many things. And we really are just interested in where are the students at. And I think faculty, if you recenter the assessment discussion away from what has to be done and the accreditation language and the compliance language, and you move it more towards student language. Don't you want to know how your students are doing? Why don't we talk about student learning? That tends to be a successful way to get faculty away from being defensive. And I can only speak to myself and my own experiences, but many of us who get involved in higher education, whether we stay in the classroom or not, we got involved because we cared about students, full stop. And reminding faculty of that, they're always aware of it, but reframing the assessment discussion to say, this is about students and this is about helping students learn. And so let's talk about what you prioritize and what's going to work for your particular department. And that's another thing I didn't mention in this, just very quickly. Assessment doesn't have to look the same for everybody. It's okay to be flexible. And it's okay for you to take into consideration certain unique particularities of a certain program and work with faculty, and don't just impose this very rigid one-size-fits-all system. Sit down, speak with them, let them vent to you for a while, talk to them about this sort of stuff, and find something that works for them and that works for you and the institution, and most importantly for the student.
Great. We have a number of other questions that we may not have an opportunity to get to all of those. Another one is, what type of activities do you suggest for a new faculty member to prepare program learning outcomes?
So for a new faculty member who is now just developing program learning outcomes for the first time, so I would say a couple of things. One is so if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's kind of a first-time faculty or a new faculty member who is now developing program learning outcomes. Is that correct, Christy?
Just as new faculty member to prepare PLOs. So yes, that is correct.
Yeah, so in that particular case, I would say connecting with outside resources, going and looking at different perhaps your disciplinary organizations. That's something that can be very valuable. So I'll just speak to my own experience. The American Association of Political Science has resources on their website that speak to learning outcomes for political science programs. I know this is true for a variety of other programs as well. So that could be a starting point. There's wonderful research and wonderful work done by organizations like the Lumina Foundation that have great working papers on developing program learning outcomes for two-year institutions. And then once again, as a new faculty member, and I can very much so identify with this because I don't think there were really program learning outcomes in political science when I arrived at Guilford Tech, that it was a process of, I would go out and just speak with the department chair at UNC Greensboro, which was one of our biggest schools that we sent students to. And through those conversations, I got a sense of what he was looking for from transfer students. And I would speak to, some politicians who some of my students would go and work on political campaigns, and I would talk to them about what they would want from our students. But I think kind of combining those external stakeholders as well as bringing in some potential disciplinary resources and some white papers from major working groups can be a good start.
Super. And we'll end with one last question that I know you're going to be answering only very briefly, but
yeah.
What does an assessment retreat look like? So what all does it consist of? If you could give us a high-level overview of an assessment retreat, that would be helpful.
Sure. So typically carve out 2 to 3 hours, have all of the faculty within a particular program or faculty across the institution, all full-time faculty, meet, can typically be on campus, and then have some sort of an assessment activity taking place. When I was at Guilford Tech, we would analyze assessment data together and have those discussions in departments, but it could also be, let's review our program learning outcomes and let's then move forward and maybe revise those, et cetera, or develop a common assignment within a program. So whatever needs you might have, make that the focus, but carving out that time and allowing faculty the room and breadth to have those assessment discussions is really critical.
Great. Thank you, Matthew, so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. I've gotten some good feedback so far, and I'd like to welcome additional feedback from folks. If you have some comments, suggestions about the webinar, please feel free to email me. You'll see my email address there on the screen, or you should have it somewhere in your inbox. We will address the other questions that we didn't get to, and we'll post that FAQ document online. We will post both the PowerPoint presentation slides and the recording if you would like to share those with others in your institution. So thank you again, everyone, for participating, and have a great rest of your day.